Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this virtual lecture by Dr. Raj Balkaran. I'm John Coyne, an Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Michigan State University, and I'll be moderating this event. To begin, I'd like to express our gratitude to the MSU Asian Studies Center's Global Virtual Speakers Program, and especially to the India Council for co-sponsoring this event. The India Council Endowment was established at Michigan State University through donations made primarily by the local Indian community. The purposes of the India Council are to encourage and stimulate interest in India by promoting and supporting educational, cultural, and other activities like this program. We're pleased that this talk is associated with the India Council, and we extend our heartfelt thanks to it. We're also grateful for the support of the Department of Religious Studies and the Foglio Chair in Spirituality for making this event possible. And on that note, I'd like to briefly hand things over to Professor Morgan Shipley to say a few words about this distinctive new chair.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to see you, Raj. So we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Raj Balkaran today, co-sponsored by the Foglio Endowed Chair of Spirituality, which honors Father Jake Foglio, an alumnus, former faculty member, longtime priest, and mentor to countless MSU student athletes and coaches. Dr. Balkaran's talk is part of the MSU Foglio Speaker Series on Spirituality, a project established to advance Father Jake's commitment to others, to the academic study of the human spirit, in relation to his efforts to expand understanding of spirituality beyond strictly religious concerns to the myriad ways humans seek to meaning and define what matters most in their lives and to their communities. The MSU Foglio Speaker Series on Spirituality creates opportunities to collectively explore the manifold applications of spirituality in the contemporary world, with a particular focus on situating, unpacking, complicating, and seeking to understand the globalization of spirituality, including issues of appropriation, its application in non-Western religious and cultural settings, and the results of both untethering spirituality from religiosity, as well as the growing tendency in Western cultures to turn to often Asian-based expressions of spirituality as a means for advancing self-help and cultivating community and belongingness. To help us navigate this complex world of insiders and outsiders, adopters and inheritors, we could not be more thrilled to welcome Dr. Balkaran, whose teaching, research, and work provide fascinating insight into the contemporary role of spirituality, its increasingly syncretic nature, and its relationship to both religious identities and secular conditions. I'd like to now return to Dr. Coyne for a more formal introduction of today's event. Thank you all again.
So now for the reason that we're all here, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Raj Balkaran, who is very active in several different areas that span audiences that are both scholarly and popular. Having earned a PhD in religion from the University of Calgary, Dr. Balkaran has published 2 books with Routledge Press, The Goddess and King in Indian Mythology, and The Goddess and the Sun in Indian Mythology, as well as a whole slew of articles and book chapters. He's an instructor and curriculum developer for the Oxford Center of Hindu Studies, and has taught many online courses for them and other organizations and schools, including the University of Toronto. Dr. Balkaran has been a digital trendsetter too, in creating podcasts about South Asian religious traditions, including over 120 episodes with authors as part of the New Books Network, over 100 episodes in a series called The Power of Myth, and over 20 episodes in a new series that began just this year entitled Life Wisdom. And somehow, in the midst of this activity, he makes time to work as a life coach as well, drawing on Hindu and Indian spiritual traditions for diverse people who seek out his advice. And it's because of his broad range of scholarly and public engagements that we're excited to hear him share some of his observations with us today. After Dr. Balkaran is finished speaking, we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Please use the chat box in this Zoom window to type your questions, which I'll then read out after he's done speaking. And we'll sort of play this by ear and see how it goes. I'll ask the first few questions, and maybe if things kind of work out, we'll have people ask the questions directly themselves by unmuting themselves and signing on with their video. So without further ado, thank you, Dr. Balkaran, for taking the time to join us today. The floor is now yours.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Some of it sounds vaguely familiar. It is my hope that you can see and hear me. Otherwise, this will be a very interesting half an hour indeed, 45 minutes. The syncretic significance of Indian spirituality, reflections from working with seekers in the West. There's this nerdy podcast that I do called New Books, in Indian religions. I mean, who would listen to that? I have no idea why anyone listens to that, but tens of thousands of people each month download these podcasts where I invite scholars to come on about their new books and talk about the nature of the book, the methodology, the historicity, the genesis of the project. And I ask questions like, so what's your book about? So what does Hinduism mean? And nevertheless, people are intrigued by this podcast. I had a scholar on the podcast. His name is John Coiney. He may be remotely familiar to some of you. We covered his book called Shared Devotion, Shared Food in June, perhaps. And the podcast came out and all was well. And everyone was happy. And then, we don't know how, an email entered in my inbox. And the email was an invitation. At first, I invited him to the podcast. So I figured, okay, this must be the mystery of karma. And now I'm receiving an invitation from this man whom I invited. And, there was a lovely explication of the context and the concerns. And the email read like a blog post or scholarly article itself, positioning the invite. And then the juice of it was, given your academic background and work, as well as your activity as a life coach. Oh, he knows I'm a life coach. That's interesting. What does that mean to you? And what that means to you? We're wondering what you might think about this, the talk in mind. In any case, it's your engagement as a scholar and a practitioner, specifically as a life coach, that prompted us to reach out. Wait, what is he asking for? And why is he asking me? I don't understand. I talk to scholars about scholarly stuff, right? Nerdy Hindu studies stuff, Purana, technical stuff, Itihasa Purana, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, words you can't pronounce, but they mean something to someone, somewhere. And I write books 12 people read. Thanks to my podcast, maybe 20 people will read them. But what is he asking me for? I don't study modern movements. I don't study Indian spirituality. I study ancient Sanskrit text. And my life coaching thing, that's kind of this side gig. Like, what's going on here? I feel like I should help him out because I enjoy speaking to people about stuff. But what is he asking for? And why me? Like, there are all these pieces. He's not asking about the online teaching piece, or is he? He's asking about the life coaching piece. He wants me to present a talk about my life coaching, but that was compartmentalized quite safely until now. And then there was a divine cybervention from one of the platforms at which I teach. I teach at a variety of online platforms. I teach at Yogic Studies. I teach at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. I teach at my own School of Indian Wisdom. And a variety of learners show up, self-proclaimed lifelong learners. I taught at the School of Continuing Studies for 10 years at the University of Toronto. People who are at various stages in their life, typically a little later in their life because they have a bit more time, maybe a bit more funds, who take courses for general interests. Yes, get this. No homework, no grades, no pleasing mommy or daddy, no job search. They want to learn and they pay money to learn. Like, imagine that. There are those who are just, well, I don't know, I haven't done much learning or continuing studies learning, but I really love India. All things Indic. I want to learn more about all things Indic. I have this irrational passion, there's a draw to learn more. Some are trying to feed a spiritual need, perhaps even a religious need, being once from a Western context, now adopting Indian religion, practices spirituality in their own life. Some are members of modern movements, like the ISKCON movement, for example. Some are self-described lapsed Hindus who stopped being Hindus for some time and now want to sort of warm up to it, but with all the critical thinking they learned from university. And some are traditional Hindus who want to learn more about the academic side of the glory of Rama and Krishna and the goddess. A variety of learners show up at these platforms, but these platforms are more or less in the etic paradigm. We're speaking about the tradition, not from within the tradition. Although we welcome the voices from within, we speak from without because that is a space from which we can all stand and grapple with this thing called Indian religion or spirituality. So this gives you the lay of the land, the backdrop, the white noise of the teaching sphere, wherein this cybervention descended. It was this forum post the day after I got this invite. I think I might have even been foolish enough to already accept this invite. And then I got this intervention from a student forum post, unscripted, unplanned. The online gods were speaking to me. One student was speaking to another about their shared experiences, responding to something that they could relate to. I grew up in a Unitarian family where faith or belonging to the church was part of life. Church never quite resonated for me, but what has stuck with me from this is wanting to have a spiritual side to my life. Wait a minute, this person is sort of implying that church isn't spiritual and spiritual isn't church. And okay, let's see what they're saying. The search for this has come out in different ways at different times. A quest, perhaps they're seeking, perhaps they're a seeker. Perhaps they're a seeker in the West, like the subtitle of this talk. A quest, to use Alistair McIntyre's expression, at a time been dormant. Much of Christian religion seems to ignore the spiritual aspect. I'm directly quoting from the student's comment, unscripted, unprompted, organically evolved in discussion with another student. Anonymized, of course, shared with their permission. Much of Christian religion seems to ignore the spiritual aspect or to offer little guidance as to how to actively follow a spiritual path, as opposed to performing ritual. Scholars can agree and disagree as to what spirituality is or whether it's a thing, but while we're busy arguing about it, actual people are busy referring to it and using it as a real term on the ground in a meaningful way. Continued, same post. And like you, I became dispirited, interesting, ironic word. I became dispirited with the actions performed in the name of the church. For me, it was the wars fought in the name of the church. How can violent opposition to others be reconciled with teachings like love thy neighbor? More recently, it has been the covering up and unwillingness to tackle the issue of sexual abuse of minors in some churches that I can't accept. I found the writings in different texts I've since studied to give the best account of spiritual life. There's an omitted section where they refer to the platform and the course they took on that platform. It was a Hindu studies course, but I don't want to give too much away. I found from the Upanishads to the Yoga Sutras, these are Indic texts, there is so much insight into both the nature of the spiritual world, there's that word again, and the practice of how to live in a more spiritual way. These students understand each other, and others on the platform understand each other. No one chimes in to say, well, what do you mean by spiritual? This is just my observation. I facilitate discussion, and I also just witness half the time to see what's going to happen next. Am I right in talking, in thinking what you say here to mean, do you have an Advaitin worldview? Are you saying all is Brahman? I mean, is that what you believe to be true? Is that your reality? Is that truth for you? This ancient Indian worldview. I'm drawn to this. I'm tempted to believe this, but tend to try and keep an open mind. When and if I successfully travel further on the path, I will, I think, gain the certainty of direct experience that gives knowledge, that gives this knowledge. Until I do, I won't be certain. I'm not quite sure about that, but that's because I haven't journeyed far enough. But I suspect the ancient Indians are right. Absolutely fascinated. You don't have to be an ethnographer to be fascinated by what these people are saying about their spiritual lives. Unscripted. I thought, okay, great. Cybervention successful. Here you go. Here's a pic. Here's a date. Here's a time. Here's a title. The syncretic significance of Indian spirituality. Great. Right? What is Indian spirituality? We still haven't defined it. We still don't know what it is. What is this talk about? You're now going to do, ethnographic, armchair ethnographic work on your side biz, on your coaching? Like, what are you doing? What on earth are you doing in this academic talk or this public talk? Well, let the data speak for itself, shall we? If we can. Let's just peek behind the coaching curtain. You've all been invited as sort of a fly on the wall in this anonymized parallel universe, to have snippets into people that are currently, presently, now, this week, last week, maybe not next week, depends on the holidays, right now being coached by one, yours truly. There is a gentleman who we will call Dario. The names came out of a hat. Dario. Dario is a white male, 45, decent looking, healthy, very intellectually oriented, very smart cookie, a wife and two fairly young kids, grade school kids, works at NASA, scientist for NASA. He's located in California. He may or may not have ties to Michigan. I'm just saying. He's earned a doctorate at an Ivy League school in America in neuroscience. He was raised from a Christian context. He still somewhat identifies with being a Christian culturally. He doesn't engage in Christian religiosity as going, in his case, to mass or saying prayers or saying Christian prayers, but he shares with his children stories and parables and teachings from Christianity and Hinduism as well. He came to me asking whether we could study a text together, a particular Upanishad that's fascinated him, the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. Don't worry about the name. It's a fascinating Upanishad, these wisdom texts from ascetic traditions in ancient India that features classical Hindu philosophy that glorifies the god Shiva as supreme. And he was fascinated by this text. He took courses at various platforms, but he didn't want fully the Indic perspective. He wanted to understand how tradition understands these texts. His aim was to try to integrate the wisdom in these texts in his own life, in his own reflections, in his own thinking. He has a fairly scientific, perhaps secular worldview. He is intriguingly ambivalent about karmic theory and reincarnation. Perhaps he thinks it is a wonderful way to account for why he's interested in such things, but he doesn't know and remains agnostic, for he cannot know, for he is perennially a scientist. And yet he's called, he's drawn to the meaning and the wisdom within these texts so as to study privately one-on-one to integrate them. And not only integrate the wisdom of the texts, engage in practices, receive mantric initiations, chant various mantras at various times, observe various traditional Hindu holidays. And of course, in that, in the psycho-spiritual mix that is this paradigm of this cross between therapy and lineal training, and gods know what else is going on there, we also talk about his professional life and strategize on ways in which to grow. This is just one peephole behind the coaching curtain. And then there's Blake. Blake's a little older, also white, also male, also American. Good 20, 25 years-ish older than Dario, I believe his name was. Yes. He has a wife. His kids are growing out of the house. He's a retired lawyer, had a very high-powered career for a long time, was very much called to Indian spirituality in the 70s and 80s, dabbled here and there, but didn't start taking it serious until 2 to 3 years ago. And about a year or two ago, somehow he came across me. He's located in Texas, FYI. He has advanced degrees. His children are raised. He was raised Christian, but dispensed with that worldview fairly young in life. And now he has fully subscribed to the Indic worldview. Karma is real. Rebirth is real. The gods of India are real. The mantric recitation will summon the Shakti of the gods to transform your psyche and your life. Situations rise and fall born of his previous actions. It is his samskaras, his patterning, that pulls him towards this ancient knowledge, because nothing in what he calls his redneck upbringing, his words, not mine, could possibly have prepared him for this. And he too, there's a strong textual exegesis. He wants to learn about the goddess, the Devi Mahatmya, the grandeur of the goddess, and he wants to learn how to integrate the myths of the goddess into practices of the goddess. And he engaged in a very intense regimen of sadhana, of spiritual practice, of mantric spiritual practice for the Goddess Festival, the 9 nights autumnal Goddess Festival that took place in the Indic world last month. We also talk about personal growth, patterns that have plagued him for decades that are now magically dissolved. by the grace of the goddess, perhaps, or some good coaching, or some from column A, some from column B. You can be the judge. And then there's June, lovely June, also white, also American, a female, married, kids are grown, out of the house, retired, worked in healthcare, found yoga to help her during a very difficult health crisis in her life years ago, stayed with it, teaches yoga. One could say she's a yoga teacher. Graduate degrees in medicine. Like the previous case study, fully ascribes to the Indic worldview. Karma is real, samsara is real, the gods are real, mantra is powerful, the practices are real. Was indoctrinated in a particular spiritual lineage, a very common, popular lineage, public lineage, without naming names, and had received a great deal of training on Indic thought, Indic culture, Indic practice for years, over a decade. It was discovered there were some improprieties of a sexual nature with some of the teachers and some young women in that path. It was discovered there were various other things that didn't add up. And in her view, in the view of many who have fallen away, were less than honest or respectful. And so you have this individual who's fully embraced this worldview, who now, in her perspective, is part of this extremely toxic path that she needs help detoxing from. What can I keep? What can't I keep? Do I keep asanas? Do I keep the sequence that the path taught me? Is this mantra polluted because this fallen Swami initiated me? Can I do the mantra and not have it associated with this path? How do I move forward with these wisdom teachings? I'm sort of channeling her perspective, right? How do I move forward with these teachings? I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And the bathwater is so gross, I could barely look at the basin presently. What do I do? How do we separate the wheat from the chaff? How do I protect myself from that tradition? How do I wean myself off of that path, but still practice these practices or similar practices? Where can I get other practices? How do I continue my asana practice? Should I even be teaching any of this anymore? Are the teachings tainted? Because the teachers were tainted. Oh, such a glorious, glorious conversation. She's in a much, much, much better space. These people are real. They walk the earth. These aren't concepts. There was a chap named Vijay, a young male, Indian male. Parents are South Indian Brahmins with whom he lives on and off. Okay, business administrator, lead business, did quite well. Just not too long out of his undergrad. Felt sort of alienated during his undergrad and before that, growing up as an Indian American. And nevertheless, he had his times where he separated growing up, and then he found his way back in his around early 20s, and he's part of an active spiritual religious life at home. He has Hindu parents, right? He has more practices than he knows what to do with. Why did he find me? He found me because his mother found me. Why did his mother find me? From a podcast I did. Why did his mother send him to me? Well, it's an honor. I mean, your son is pretty precious, like your child, someone dear to you. You must, one would infer she trusts the person to send her son that way. Well, I know you're struggling and you need a life coach. And, I think he's the kind of coach you need. Well, what do you mean the kind of coach you need? Based on what? Based on his training in Indian spirituality. Based on his training in Hinduism. Based on the wisdom traditions that he has access to academically and personally. He can guide you with your practical life problems, but he can do so in a way that's not going to eclipse or occlude your relationship with Indian traditions. They show up. Who knows how they show up? they show up. He's being coached into an important transition, an adulting stage, if you will. He's about to start an important phase of entrepreneurship, and he wants to sort of find himself first. He's just left a job he was at for a few years and doing quite well. And he's in a transitional stage. And the vast majority of the coaching is practical life coaching, EQ, productivity, relationships, mindset, habits for success. And yet, every once in a while, there'll be a little sprinkling of Indian religions here and there. These people are real. I haven't made that up. For all of my creativity, I'm not that imaginative. Abhijit, 30 to 35, an Indian man, a Brahmin, spent a number of born and raised in India. As a teenager, went to the UK, lived there for 10 years, then went to America. So many layers of his acculturation. The Indian parents back at home have a particular paradigm in their mind. His exposure to Western culture and his draw for Western culture, this push and pull, his success story as being a professional on Wall Street, his feeling of being marginalized because he's one of the few Hindus, he's one of the few people of color or his color, feeling an outsider to the old boys club. I'm sort of paraphrasing what's come up in our conversations. I mean, he's on Wall Street, his education's in finance, but his outlook is staunchly Hindu. He wants a Hindu wife. His wife must be Hindu. His kids must be Hindu. If the wife wants to eat meat, that's okay, but not at home. But I kind of like foreign women. And foreign for him actually means foreign from the Indic culture. They have to do these practices. You know, I'm from a Brahmin lineage and I'm lapsed because I'm not doing my evening puja, I'm not doing my morning puja. You know, look at what I've become. I'm a Vaishya, I'm a merchant, I'm caught up in this world. I'm a disgrace to my lineage. Let me at least have a proper Indian family. Let me at least make a lot of money so I could found a Hindu foundation. I had a call on Friday. Every once in a while, someone goes to my website. I don't know how they find me. And they book a discovery call because I won't coach anybody who I haven't had a pro bono discovery call with, so we can gauge if it's a good fit. And unfortunately, I'm a healer and helper before I'm a businessman. The entrepreneurship is just a way to monetize my mission in the world. And so, you know, you want to make sure you can give that person what they need, and it's a good fit. I got on the call, young man, Punjabi American, as he calls it, right? His parents are from Punjab, 27-ish, live-in girlfriend, relationship issues. Why? I have particular cultural understandings of masculinity, and they really get in the way of the kind of masculinity that I need to have a proper relationship with this woman. And I found you. I'm shopping around for life coaches. You're one of 3 I'm talking to, and it sounds like you would understand this dual citizenship, the translating across this divide, right? Yes, sure, yes. Life coaching, no problem. I've done relationship work before, no problem. I completely understand the tensions. I've done a fair bit of work with men on their vision of masculinity, actually. Great, right? Great. Oh, but there's one rub. You know, you mentioned somewhere in your coaching that you also do spiritual paradigms or spiritual coaching. And if there was one kind of strike, you're perfect. But if there's one kind of strike against you, it's that, you know, you engage Indian spirituality. And I said, well, the coaching would be the coaching. I mean, we're not doing theology. There's nothing being sold to you. I coach. If someone's a Christian and they're a devout Christian, I coach mindful of a Christian paradigm, right? It's neither here nor there. But, you know, I was a practitioner. And then for the last 2 or 3 years, I stopped practicing. I started reading about the history of Hinduism, critical engagement. I found your podcast, that godforsaken podcast of yours. I love it. And that's how I found you. And I'm really not comfortable with practicing anymore. So for the first time ever, I said to him very tactfully, listen, then you have your answer. No harm, no foul. You've got 3 people you're considering. You have to be comfortable with who you're working with. Otherwise, you're wasting your money and both of your time. No problem. All the best. You're not into Indian spirituality. It's neither here nor there. It doesn't have to be part of our coaching, but you're so adverse to it because of your critical engagement of the tradition that there's now a prejudice there. Amazing. Last week, I got an email from a woman named Pauline. Pauline's a yoga teacher in Australia. I've been so enjoying the mantras course. I have an online school. Many, many humble thanks for this delicious offering. Delicious mantra on the tongue, get it? I enrolled in a course on the chakras, offered by an American on Facebook, Q guffawing. And surprise, surprise, it was so disappointing I withdrew within 10 minutes of the live feed. I don't know who the person is. It's neither here nor there, but this is happening. Do you offer a course on the study of chakras? I would love it if you did. Second part of the email, more apropos perhaps our conversation. I'm curious and increasingly squeamish about the narrative surrounding middle-aged white women adopting the cultural practices of Hindu philosophy, being as I am a middle-aged white woman teaching yoga. Can you please share your thoughts? Or some way I can rationalize my desire to adopt and espouse this ancient wisdom tradition while sparing me the label of cultural misappropriator. You would not believe, or you would. Among my studentship, I do nothing to target yoga or talk about yoga. There are so many advanced yoga practitioners and teachers who are so concerned about this, right? Female, 55-ish, white, married, children, all children are still in the house, professional yoga teacher, Australia. She has a BA in her YTT. She studied in the arts. She's raised Christian, but she has an Indic worldview. The chakras are real. Samsara, rebirth, is real. Karma, the principle of action-reaction that decides our fate, is real. The gods are real. Shakti is real. How do I reconcile that without being, a misappropriator, as she calls it? Can we have a coaching session about that? Sure, why not? I think a single session will suffice. Let's just have a conversation. Issues about diet. Is it okay? I'm a yoga teacher and sometimes I eat meat. Is that okay? What do I do about this whole feeling of shame or guilt around culture appropriation? What does that look like? A variety of strategies and tactics and answers ensued for her in her particular circumstance. One of the things I said to her is, of course, we have to be mindful of all of these issues without question. And also, how do we honor our own calling? How do we honor what we're called to do with our lives? How do we honor the very worldview that you're steeped in that says we are not our bodies, we are not our cultures, we are samskaras from previous lives? How do we reconcile all that? So we had a rich and interesting conversation. And I said to her, look, you, believe it or not, and people like you are an enormous part of the online school of Indian wisdom that doesn't do anything to target yoga people whatsoever. There's nothing in the branding or the logo about yoga. And yet, who wants that are yoga teachers and practitioners looking for enrichment. Why? So they can acknowledge the soil. They can acknowledge a tree while plucking the fruit. The fruit's not in midair as some kind of secular artificial entity. The fruit hails from an ancient Indic tradition, multiple of traditions. And that is where they're coming from. And this is what I've learned. The school was opened in March earlier this year as a crystallization of 5 years of online teaching in a variety of spaces. And I'm learning more and more that without consciously trying, people who are concerned about this are seeking out spaces like the school where they can grapple with Indian spirituality, Indian religion. I taught a course at Yogic Studies a year ago, and one of the students in the course was such a yoga teacher like Pauline, and she was talking to one of her students, who were serious yoga students, who happened to work in publishing, and that person went to someone in their press and said, "Hey, We should do a whole book about this. And then I got an email 2 months later. Those invitation emails, you never know what's going to come. I got an invitation email. And last month, the writing is done. The book will be about in a couple of months. But what is it? It's not about how to do yoga. It's about the narratives behind the world of yoga. The yoga postures are named after certain narratives. There's currently a course at the school, just to give you a snippet, a sense, a taste. Shiva, well, what does Shiva have to do with yoga? Well, he's Yogeshwara. He's the Lord of Yogis. He's the Lord of Yoga. Yada, yada, yada. Okay, fine. Wrathful Shiva. This wrathful, fierce form of Shiva called Bhairava, whose vahana, whose vehicle is the dog. Here it's a very left-handed depiction of Bhairava, typically naked with a skull in his left hand. Well, what does this have to do with yoga? What are you talking about? Well, there's a posture called Bhairavasana. We'll skip downward dog and upward dog. There's lots I could say about that. There's a posture called Bhairavasana. Why is it called Bhairavasana? Why is it named after this form of Shiva? Why is Vishwamitrasana named after sage Vishwamitra? Clearly, they weren't bored. They didn't just pick these names because there's a shortage of names in Sanskrit. I assure you, there's no shortage of names in Sanskrit. You pick these names because they pertain to the posture, the inner posture and the outer posture. And these are some connections that are being made in the field of tapping Indian spirituality, quote unquote, Indian tradition, in a way that feels safe and respectful and somehow acceptable to those who are seeking this knowledge, seeking some kind of acculturation to the roots of yoga. How many personalities does one need to have to, in the course of a week, do an academic conference talk, speaking to specialists about the nitty-gritty and the historical junctures, philosophical concepts, about the theory? Or perhaps, have a contract to teach university students in the fall, where it's specialist academic content, but you can lean more into making it a little more accessible, bringing a little bit more of experience in there. Continuing studies. You're speaking from the outside of the tradition, but many people in the room might be practitioners sharing their insights as well. Many people have lived various interesting lives and have much to share about what this concept might mean in practice. Or public engagement, where anybody could be in the room. Podcasting. The specialist in your field is listening to the podcast at the same time as someone who is just really interested in India, or someone who wants some enrichment for the yoga practice. That's a different resolution. Private consultation. Speaking to that person where they're at. Typically more in an emic context if they are religious, or if they adopt Indian spirituality as the gospel truth. Who's the audience? And where do we pitch this? Should the academy have a monopoly on the pen? Is the ink watered down when extended for the public? What on earth? What have we learned from these people? What have we learned? What parallels can we draw? What conclusions can we draw? Is there something to be said about whiteness and culture appropriation, about practice life, about, there's so many questions. What trends do we discern here? How do we make sense of these people who are engaging Indian spirituality, whether or not they're practicing another religion, quote unquote, or themselves are Hindus, quote unquote, or lapsed Hindus, quote unquote? What does it mean? This is a thing. Okay, and this thing's going to grow, whether we figure out what it is or not. It's happening because all that I've shown you has been attracted without trying. I don't target any of these people. I don't do Facebook ads. This is just who shows up, who needs help in the world right now, in my particular field, right? In my echo chamber. Who's Western? What if you're born in the West, educated in the West, and your parents are of Indic background? Are you Western? Are you Hindu? Are you Hindu and Western? What's at stake? And really, for me, what's the path forward? What's the world that we want to build? What does it look like in 100 years and 500 years and 1,000 years? How do we find a way for people to respectfully leverage the legacy of human ingenuity cross-culturally? How do we make it safe and respectful for people to engage Indian spirituality irrespective of their circumstances? What sort of world do we want to build? What is the future of such enterprise? Small questions, I know. I've left you with all the questions. I have no answers. Perhaps some interesting questions. Thank you for listening to whatever this was, this reflection.
Thank you very much, Dr. Balkaran. This is certainly a rich and provocative, inspiring talk. And thank you also for being so willing to share from your experience and be talking about these things that are kind of outside the typical lane of what we would do in academics. I mean, this is honestly, especially I'm mindful that we have a lot of students listening, this is not exactly the typical academic talk. This is, it's sort of risky. You've allowed yourself to sort of be in a vulnerable place of not doing a typical academic talk, and we're really appreciative that you've entertained this invitation. What we're doing here, I think you set us up to have some really rich conversations about code switching, about what kinds of lanes we're able to move in and what lanes might be available and are emerging in front of our own eyes. So thank you very much for this.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. The goal is to speak to people in the audience who may see themselves and others in these stories that I've shared. And so by all means, ask questions. This is the best part.
And so I appreciate too that at the beginning, this is before maybe everybody signed in, but you had mentioned that you were kind of going to leave us hanging with some questions at the end, specifically to be generating conversation about them. So I definitely appreciate that. So I'm looking here.
Gretel, I should put my glasses on, has her hand up. I don't mind unmuting if that's okay with folks.
We can certainly do that. I hope that things are set up right now. If not, let me just check, unmute, just resetting a few things here. So at least the mute, Gretel, you should be able to unmute yourself. I don't know if you can turn your video on too.
Well, no,
Yeah, please go ahead.
I can't right now, but actually the chat seems to be disabled. I was going to try to type something in the chat and I couldn't. Maybe it's my.
Thank you for letting us know. Yeah.
That's interesting. I'm seeing some individual chats. But,
oh, are you? Okay, maybe then it's my fault.
But only individual ones. So if you're not able to, I need to. There. Sorry, now I've turned it on.
Perfect.
Thank you.
I'll enter my question now. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sure. If anyone else wants to type or raise their hand, as you prefer.
Yeah, thank you, Gretel, for pointing that out. As people type some questions in there, I'm wondering, Raj, if you could say maybe a little bit about how you see, you're obviously comfortable with the word life coach, and that's what you
barely, but yes.
Okay, well, thank you for saying that too. So there's life coach. There's this quite traditional term, guru, that is central to so many Indic traditions, especially Hindu ones. Do you have a sense of what the difference might be, taking for granted that, you're kind of now charting out the territory in front of us while using some traditional terms? So any thoughts about sort of the difference between a life coach and a guru?
Yes, it seems to me that there's a world of difference insofar as a guru to function requires a relationship with a disciple. For that relationship to function, firstly, and secondly, a guru, a traditional Indian guru, will work only within a particular paradigm or parampara or worldview. So those are two important distinctions insofar as I'm a coach and I have clients. There's no obligation There's no bhakti, there's no seva, there's no indentureship between sessions. And secondly, a life coach is going to give someone practical advice for their inner or outer life, wherever they're at, particularly not from a spiritual paradigm, and particularly not from a particularly religious paradigm. The one-on-one consultation I do is so unique that there's no real proper word for it. It's a personal consultation that involves a mix of processing through what one might do in a talk therapy environment versus content enrichment versus strategy about the path forward. So life coaching is the umbrella that I think approximate that. And part of that is so that people understand this is a service that's offered in a transactional paradigm and not a relationship that's entered into with all the trappings and the mess and the expectations attached thereto.
Well, thank you very much for that. I see that there's one question here that's come in. This is from David Stowe. Roughly what percentage of life coaches integrate or are attuned to spiritual dimensions, would you guess? Do you find that background makes offering life coaching easier or harder for you?
I really couldn't tell you. From the coaches that I've chanced upon, there are a variety of paradigms. The people who take a course over a weekend in their life coach, the people who do specific coaching related to storytelling or spirituality or religiosity. So my sense is that there are life coaches of all stripes for all clientele. Do you find that background makes offering life coaching easier or harder for you? I'm not entirely sure what that means in terms of the client's background. I haven't really come across a background that I couldn't work with. So not particularly, so far as my consultation or my paradigm isn't wedded to a particular worldview. It's just that more and more over the last year, especially, the people who show up are very much interested in Indian practices and spirituality. That was not the way for the 4 years before that. For the 4 years before that, it was much more practical life coaching. And now it's people showing up who are trying to reconcile these issues. I came a little late. Here's a direct message. I'll read it aloud I'm with my glasses on, hopefully. I came a little late. Apologies for that. No problem. You're forgiven. But are all the examples of people you mentioned, people who came to you with religious crisis? That's a great question. Were they asking you for help on how they should handle these crises? No, not necessarily at all. That's what's so fascinating. One who was trying to detox from what she perceived to be a very toxic path, I would say that was a form of crisis, albeit a sort of numb, internalized crisis that she was used to. The others weren't in crisis. They were looking for enrichment. They wanted to deepen their practice. They wanted to enrich their lives. Most of the work is more of a vitamin than a painkiller. Thank you, Max. If any of you want to turn your cameras on or speak up, you're welcome to. I promise I won't bite. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm wondering how you found yourself on the life coach path. That's a wonderful question. And how did it relate, at least initially, if at all, to your academic life? It didn't at all. I think John crystallized it actually with his invitation. Which came first, or maybe they coexisted. I think it is an interesting question for students interested in extra-traditional, more holistic life paths. Which are more and more these days, I think. Yes. So my academic path was its own thing, and more or less is to this point. Coaching is something, what I call coaching now, consultation, the doling of advice. I remember being in middle school and a teenager, and for some reason I was able to give adults advice, and it resonated, and there's something in me innate, a gene, a samskara, who knows what, where that's just part of my swabhava, my disposition, right? My skill set. It wasn't until I graduated from my doctorate. I started school, I left my undergrad, dropped out of my undergrad, went back, finished it, did a master's half-time, took a year off. By the time I started my PhD, I was 31 years old. So I was like, okay, I need to get in and get out and move on. So I did it over 4 years, and I finished it in 2015. And I had never experienced what I experienced. There were no jobs at all at the academy, and nothing was working for me. I had a vast network and all kinds of work experience. I worked so much alongside my degrees over the years. Nothing. I rang in 2016 with 4 cents to my name. Line of credit maxed out, credit cards maxed out. It had been 4 months after finishing my doctoral funding because I defended. And I'm like, what on earth? And then I had no choice but to start to ask if people wanted courses. I marketed a course. I had enough to pay my bills in January 2016. And it grew. And then people started coming and asking for consultations. They asked, do you do consultations? And I'm like, I've never charged for it before, but hey, why not? And I learned that it was exceptionally valuable what was happening in that hour to people. And they were happy to pay a premium for it, and their lives were changing. And all this was with the thought, oh, that professorship is coming any minute now. After 2 years of that, before I knew it, online education was starting to take off for me. And by 2020, it was like, okay, now the academics are asking me how to teach online and how to create podcasts. And so I'm in this space of producing my scholarship while meaningfully adding value to people's lives. And that wouldn't change if a professorship ripened tomorrow. I enjoy it too much. Long-winded answer, but hopefully you enjoyed it.
Well, to my mind, that also speaks to something of a transformation that is happening on a number of levels, not just religious and spiritual, but institutional, about where we talk about these things. Previously, you can go to a university, sign up for a course, get a credential at the end of that, get a degree or something, a certification, but that's not really maybe necessary for or relevant to how one lives one's life. And to my mind, it brings up a sort of a question about like how one relates to, say, tradition and community, which is somewhat intact if we're not, say, moving around and virtual. What I'm hearing from you, Raj, is it sounds very sort of individual oriented. That's not a criticism. It's just sort of, it seems, is individual oriented, maybe entrepreneurial, which is also, I think, fairly individual, but maybe responding to a community that's maybe diffuse and no longer easily locatable in like one space or one organization. It's not really a question as much as just sort of a reflection that these comments have raised.
What comes to mind for me is that without trying, the school is attracting a community of people. I do live Zoom tutorials and the people are starting to know each other, right? And there is this community forming. And it occurs to me that part of the value of the school is not just pedagogical, it's very much social for people who, for whatever reason, they find shared experiences in many of the other students, or at least they have a similar worldview. And to me, I think, especially in these times, the communal need that humans have is more and more being filled in the online space. That's not to, in any way, shape, or form, suggest that the in-person space can be replaced. But in the absence of that opportunity, you have to understand all these people that I coach are all over the place. I would never cross paths with them. The people that study at the school, I would never cross paths with these people. They're all over the States, Canada, the UK, some in Southeast Asia. So there is this sense things are really shifting. And one of the ways they're shifting is the wild west of the online medium now has to be refined, and settlements have to pop up. And we need to harness that and cultivate proper space in the online medium.
Maybe these new communities are somewhat like the New Books Network or the podcast series. This is one kind of new virtual incarnation of these.
Well, it became abundantly clear, especially post-COVID, that this weird thing I was doing on the side of online teaching and this podcast, all of a sudden it was like, okay, we need this. We need online content more than ever before, especially for teaching. Mm-hmm. If any of you are feeling a little shy, but you have a question about one of these practitioners, or something really annoys you about what I said, or something really, you want to hear more, just use the little private chat function and I'll answer your question.
Yeah, you don't have to post publicly. Thank you for that. And also, I just want to thank Allie for asking about the links. I had intended to put them in there and I just sort of blanked that. So yeah, thanks for supplying those. And I'd call everybody's attention to the chat where there are links to Raj's website and more information about his podcasts.
Thank you, Raj, for a great talk. Lots of thoughts I have. I have 2 pages full of notes trying to distill out what just happened. But I'm wondering, throughout the talk, and specifically when you started talking about the examples that you have, I was thinking of Ursula King, who in her book on spirituality says that it might be more important to think about what spirituality does than to try to define what it is. And I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about that a little bit in relation to your own experience, because I see there's a tension in some of your examples between those who seek maybe a deeper type of understanding that might lead to what it does or to a practice, or those who are really seeing it as something kind of untethered from a definitional idea of spirituality and rather something that really emboldens their life to do certain things. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
Absolutely, that's apt. Without question, in my perspective of the work that I do and what I've shared, what I've endeavored to do is not talk about spirituality at all. What have I said about spirituality? I've shown you what's happening in the realm of individuals who identify as spiritual or drawn to Indian spirituality, who may be Christian, they may be secularly minded, they may be spiritual but not religious. And for me, I'm presenting you with data, actual hot off the presses. This is my inbox in my coaching chair in the last couple of weeks. This is happening right now. And you very bright, heady scholars can make sense of it, but I've just decided to give you a peephole into what's happening.
No, I appreciate that, because I think that's the challenge, right? Is that even in that expectation of like the practice versus the definition, what's often lost there is actually encountering how people are actually engaging it. And I love the fact that you kind of end with that question, what is spirituality? We began there, but like you said, it was not the focus in this explicit way. And I think that actually says something, really concrete as to how we should be thinking about this, in terms of the work that you presented, but also within our own lives and our own experiences and what we're, seeking to uncover and understand. So thank you.
You're welcome. There is a question in the chat. Is there time to answer it?
Yes, okay, there certainly is time.
Great. You talked earlier about some of your clients having difficulty reconciling being white and their desire to engage in Indic religious traditions. I know that some believe an individual can only be born into Indic religion, especially with reincarnation being part of the faith. How do you feel about individuals borrowing from other religious traditions that they were not born into and raised with? Do you feel that they who wholly embrace the Indic worldview or Hindu religious traditions should be all in or abandon their previous beliefs? Or is it okay to study what an individual finds relevant? I'm torn about how to feel about these questions myself. Thank you for the question, and thank you for the honesty of sharing that it's something that you are working through. That actually is where this talk is pitched. It's pitched to stuff that many of you are working through, or at least observing. I can give you my perspective. I have one perspective. I really feel that it's something that each individual has to work out on their own terms with what feels right and what aligns with their values. In my particular perspective, I feel that there's something very syncretic about Hinduism in general. Various ages of religion are folded in. At one point, the Upanishads were sacrilegious because they were critiquing Vedic sacrifice. They get folded in. Tantra, to a large extent, gets folded in. Right? There's something to be said about nothing comes from nowhere, and there's a constant evolution and cross-pollination of traditions. That's sort of where I live. But I assume that people are respectful. I assume that people will acknowledge where something comes from, and that's important to acknowledge that. But I have this view of maybe I'm a little bit ahead of my time, but we're at a global village and there's a buffet and there's Indian food on the buffet and everybody should enjoy Indian food. And if some are cooks and want to be able to make samosas themselves, they're not claiming to be the author of the samosa, the inventor of the samosa. So I feel that in this world, we're really struggling to to function as a globe. It's a multi-century process that we've never had these pressures in the history of our species. And part of that is learning how all humans can have access to the legacy of humans of various cultures, if they wish to. I think as long as people are being respectful, I personally think it's only natural and probably desirable for all of us to sample the samosas and the sushi alike.
I think that's a great way to end our time together. Thank you for your eloquent talk and your responses to all these questions. And thank you so much for just taking the time to be with us, Raj. So just as a reminder to people, we are making a recording of this. The recording will be sent out to everybody who registered. And so thank you all for joining us, and hope that you have a good evening and morning and afternoon, or wherever you are as you log in. So bye.